COVID-19 transmission caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus is mainly through respiratory droplets and/or contact, but sometimes it's airborne if people in confined spaces are coughing and sneezing without covering their mouths and other people inhale that aerosol. Of the people that contract COVID-19, 80% will have mild or no symptoms, 15 to 20% will develop pneumonia, and 4% will develop acute respiratory distress syndrome and/or shock with multi-organ failure, and 1% will die from COVID-19. So I'm going to break it down for you and hopefully make it easier for you to understand why some people die from COVID-19 and others don't. We are learning about this virus all the time, but one of the major causes of death is from infection of the virus directly entering the lungs, which causes a cascade of events which can be deadly. Angiotensin converting enzyme 2, or ACE2, is an enzyme found on the outer surface of cells in the tongue, nose, back of the throat, lungs, artery, heart, kidneys, and also intestines. It is also the entry point and receptor site for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, these ACE2 receptors in the lungs are specifically located on the type 2 alveolar cells. So I'm going to use a diagram to show you exactly where these are located. Here's a diagram of the human lung. The virus makes its way into the lungs via the trachea, into the bronchus, and into the bronchioles of the lungs, eventually ending up in the alveoli. The alveoli are tiny air sacs of the lungs that allow rapid gaseous exchange between the lungs and the red blood cells. The ACE2 receptors are specifically only located on the type 2 alveolar cells. The type 1 alveolar cells actually make up the structure of the cell itself. The virus attaches to the ACE2 receptor and enters the type 2 alveolar cell. Once inside the cell, it hijacks the cell's machinery to replicate itself, create more viruses which then attach to other type 2 alveolar cells. The host cell eventually realizes that the virus is a foreign invader and that it's not supposed to be there or doing what it's doing, and so releases chemicals called cytokines as a distress signal to trigger an immune response. These cytokines coordinate the body's response to the infection by attracting immune cells to that region to attack the virus, and this causes localized inflammation. However, this coronavirus can cause excessive and uncontrolled levels of cytokines to be released, called a cytokine storm, and this then activates many more immune cells and causes hyperinflammation, which can cause harm or even kill the patient. So sometimes when the SARS-CoV-2 virus enters the lung, the body's reaction to the infection goes into overdrive with an overreaction to the body's immune system, absolutely destroying the alveolar cells by letting fluid into them. And there's bleeding from the pulmonary capillaries that go into the alveoli, there's proteins deposited, there are blood clots that form in the capillaries, and these get cluttered and severely affects the blood supply to the lungs. So there's absolute chaos and carnage going on within the lungs. So let's compare what's going on underneath the microscope. This is normal alveolar cell tissue from a healthy individual. However, this is from a patient who died of COVID-19. As you can see, it's absolute chaos and devastation with the deposition of proteins and cellular debris. As if the damage and inflammation caused by the cytokine storm wasn't enough, the presence of the virus in the cell affects the ability of angiotensin converting enzyme 2, or ACE2, to convert angiotensin 2 into angiotensin 1,7 and angiotensin 1,9, allowing vasodilation and a widening of the pulmonary arteries, increasing blood flow to the lungs. Instead, the presence of angiotensin 2 stimulates vasoconstriction and a narrowing of the pulmonary arteries, and in turn causing more inflammation and scarring in the lungs. The hypotension caused by the vasoconstriction of the pulmonary arteries means that the right side of the heart has to work a lot harder, and the reduced blood flow to the lungs also means that there is a reduced oxygenation in the blood, and that prevents the organs receiving the amount of oxygen that they need, and in turn eventually leads to organ failure. Now, the right side of the heart has to work harder and harder, which means it's gradually going to get weaker and weaker. So all this adds up to the fact that there is heart failure too, and the patient can die from that. We can really see the difference of what is happening in the lungs by comparing the lung x-rays of a normal healthy individual and someone suffering from acute respiratory distress syndrome as a result of COVID-19, which could kill the patient. Here in the normal chest x-ray, the black represents air and everything is normal here. If we compare this to an x-ray of a COVID-19 patient with acute respiratory distress syndrome, we see all the black has gone, which means all the air has gone, and that makes it incredibly difficult for sufficient oxygen to get into the pulmonary capillaries. We are learning about this new coronavirus all the time, and there are a number of reasons as to why the severity of the disease differs among individuals. The virus only gets into cells that express the ACE2 receptor. So if the virus only gets into the nose, mouth and throat, the patient can develop cold-like symptoms only. If the virus gets into the lungs, then that's when we have the chance of acute respiratory distress syndrome developing. How much virus gets into the body is also a factor. This is your viral load and can determine how sick you get. The severity of the disease is also determined by gene variations within individuals and sex. For example, estrogen inhibits some of the chemicals involved in the cytokine storm, which may explain why women have less severe disease than men. Also, the patient may be on medication that affects COVID-19. For example, if the patient is on medication that contains angiotensin receptor blockers, then they may have less severe disease than others. So as you can see, there are a number of factors affecting the severity of disease and why some people die from COVID-19 and others don't.